Welcome everyone to this webinar on voice and visibility with the Dissertation Coach and Dissertation by Design. I'm Jessica Parker. I'm the owner and CEO of Dissertation Coach and Dissertation by Design. And Kimberly Becker is one of our academic writing consultants and dissertation coaches. And she's also a linguist. This is a webinar I've presented in the past, and I asked Kimberly if she wanted to put her spin on it today. Because this is really her area of expertise. But in terms of why we picked this topic, voice comes up a lot, not usually necessarily in that word, like people don't necessarily say voice. But oftentimes when I converse with novice scholars, like graduate students and even early career faculty, they'll talk about things like, I'm not really confident, I don't feel comfortable like making claims in my writing, or how do you know when you're ready to take a stance? And the reality is it takes experience, but there are some very practical strategies that you can take in order to strategically enhance your voice and make your stance very clear in your work. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kimberly. I will be here looking at the chat and the Q&A, so I'll be happy to answer questions that I can answer while Kimberly is presenting.
Hi, everyone. Jessica, can you see my... Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Good. Yay. All right. Hi, everybody. Well, my name is Kimberly Becker, and today I'm going to be talking about voice and visibility and kind of how to craft your own author self kind of through a few linguistic resources. Just a little bit about me. As Jessica said, I'm a linguist. I'm an applied linguist, which means that I take what I know about the science of language and I apply it. And this can happen in many different fields, but in my case, it has always been used to teach. And so I typically have taught English as a second language or as an extra language learners in the beginning of my career. And in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, I have shifted and I've started to think about how academic English, specifically like research writing, is more like a second language. So nobody speaks it as a native language. And so the way that I teach and the way that I approach it is like to give you resources, linguistic resources that you can take with you and apply in your own writing. So today I'll be sort of framing the problem a little bit, setting it up for why this matters and what this is. And then I'll give some definitions and examples in context. And then I'll show you how, if you would like to use generative AI, what are some prompts that you can use so that you're not using it as a ghostwriter, but rather as more like a coach or kind of like a rhetorical mentor. And then there should be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But as Jessica said, please feel free to add your questions. And then if anything is like really pressing, she'll interrupt me. Okay, so I don't know if you all have access. I know you don't have access to the chat. I'm wondering if you have access to...
Kimberly, I just activated the chat, so they should be able to use
Oh,
it.
great. Yeah, I just am looking to see like what do you know about voice? What's your current understanding of voice? And it's just to kind of get a sense of where you all are. You can do this with the A and the B and the C. Like A is I'm not sure. B is I have a basic understanding. C is I understand it well. Or you can do it with an emoji if the A, B, C is too boring. I know somebody is here and it's really late at night, so we got to work on keeping that person awake. Okay, looks like a lot of A's and B's. Oops. Good. Yeah. Okay. That's great. If you don't know, that's okay. I did not know this until I went and got a master's in teaching English as a second language. I never learned this as a native speaker. Even as an English major, I never learned this. So don't worry about that. When you leave here, you'll know more than most anybody, I would say. Okay. So let's talk about one of the most persistent and influential myths that really we have in academia, which is this idea that science is some sort of purely objective, um, thing that is completely free from values or beliefs or any sort of cultural influence. Of course, science strives to be objective from the perspective of methods and peer review. But as humans, we know that complete neutrality is not possible and it's not desirable. And so many scholars from a lot of different disciplines like philosophy, linguistics, and even in some of the hard sciences have shown that every observation is filtered through what we already know, our assumptions, and whatever paradigm we're working in. And so historically, this idea, and I actually didn't know this, I was preparing for this webinar and I found this out. This comes from the 19th century when photography emerged. And the hope was that the camera could let nature sort of speak for itself. But these researchers discovered that and made the connection that just as a photograph interprets reality, scientists do the same thing. And so that's kind of the point, that scientific work is not neutral or objective. It's human work. And so it reflects our concerns, our commitments, and the context that we're doing it in. And so we need to drop this idea that it's going to be neutral. Our voice and our stance is what actually makes us stand out as writers, and it's what separates experts from novices. And I know that from my own and others' research. So it's not a question, it's not my opinion. It really is an empirically determined decision that we've made through linguistic research. Okay, so here's a metaphor that I like to use when I'm working with clients um, to sort of help them understand, because it is hard when you're a student or when you don't feel confident with your voice as a writer, to assert yourself and to really join the conversation. And so the first step is seeing it as a conversation. If you don't already see the literature as a conversation that is in progress, then you're writing in a vacuum, right? And that's not how we write. That's not the reality. When you join any sort of disciplinary conversation, you're stepping into a dialogue, and that dialogue is already underway. People are going back and forth with their findings. They're sharing others' findings. They're questioning those findings. They're bolstering those findings. They're debating their interpretations. All of this is a conversation. And so when you become a researcher, you join that space. You pull up your chair to the table. And so your job is not to just summarize, because this is what a lot of novices do. They just summarize what's been said. They don't know how to respond or position themselves. And so this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to show you what are some specific linguistic resources you can use to build your rhetorical toolbox, and to really help you sort of join that dialogue with some confidence. Okay, so this has always been a challenge for novice researchers, this issue of voice, because joining a conversation is a power play. And so it's a move to not just join a conversation, but a disciplinary community. And when you're a graduate student, you're kind of the low rung on the ladder of that disciplinary community. You haven't yet developed any ethos or clout. And so you're joining a conversation where everybody is sort of in a power position above you, and that's hard to do. But it's even harder now that we have generative AI, which will output this text for us that looks on the surface, top notch and really clear. So we have to understand, like, okay, what makes it top notch, and then how can I separate my voice from the voice of that generative AI tool if I'm going to use it. So let me tell you a little story to just sort of explain this. I was recently talking to a graduate student who had failed an assignment, and she was really disappointed because the assignment was what she thought well written. She had used Grammarly. Grammarly had not flagged any errors. Um, she had been encouraged to use generative AI as sort of a collaborator to improve her writing. And when she looked at the final report, she was very pleased. So then when she got a failing grade, she was very confused because her submission was highly polished. It had no errors. It was really perfect, polished. But the feedback she got from her professor was that the argument was not supported, the sources weren't synthesized, and that the author had not positioned herself within the text. So, in other words, that professor is saying, where is your voice? I don't hear your voice. I hear you sort of dumping information into the text, but I don't hear your voice. And I think this is a situation that's going to become more and more common as students begin to collaborate with generative AI. And what this means is that the deliverable products they submit are going to start looking better on the surface than they used to. They're going to seem quite polished and quite error-free. But when it comes to writing, there's a lot more below the surface that's going on that we would consider kind of the meat of the writing. And so, what we consider good writing, you might think of it as, perfect grammar or clear flow or having all the formatting correct, like your APA 7 formatting or your Chicago style formatting. But those aspects really are just the surface. They're not what matter in the conversation that's happening in academic research writing. And I do think technology can help us to improve this. It can definitely help us to improve, these sort of, I usually call these like mechanical issues. So spelling, punctuation, obviously grammar, APA 7 formatting, and even flow to some extent. Flow is like the connection of the ideas. I think tools like Grammarly, like generative AI, or like ReciteWorks for APA 7 formatting are really great tech tools to help us with that. But what no tool can do is to add our own voice because tools or technology, they don't have a voice. And so your reader is concerned with these issues that are really below the surface, and your reader, who is probably not a linguist and may or may not be trained in like writing feedback, which by the way is its own discipline and people study that, and if they haven't studied that through no fault of their own, they may not really know how to tell you what they're looking for. So you'll get this feedback like, well, I don't really hear your voice, I can't really tell where your stance is. And so this is why, and I think AI is going to make this worse. So today I want to really give you some tools to start to move in a direction of adding your voice. So here's a simple way to think about it. On the left side, we have a very neutral sentence from an academic paper. And when I say neutral, I mean it doesn't have a positive or a negative like valence. It's just kind of bland or in the middle. The paper discusses the impact of X. There's no feeling associated with, does the paper do it well? Do I believe the paper? Do I doubt the paper? Is this building on other research? It's just information, right? The paper discusses the impact of X. So that's what I mean by neutral language. It shows us the writer's thinking about the paper. There's nothing grammatically wrong with it. It's a perfect sentence. But if we compare it to the sentence on the right, which is the positioned sentence, I'm calling it, like we could hear a voice here in this sentence. So first of all, there's an I. I argue that, fill in the blank, X, while widely studied, has been misunderstood in terms of. So now we have this personal pronoun. We have words like while and widely that really help us to see the impact of these. So even though the neutral sentence uses impact, now we know what is the exact impact that this writer thinks this paper has. And so we see the writer engaging with the text in a different way. And so this isn't just speculation, as I indicated in the beginning. This is what my research looks at. And here's another example that comes from my research. I compared purpose statements of graduate students. I collected a big corpus or like a collection or a database of graduate student coursework papers. And I collected a huge amount of expert published writing. And then I just looked at their purpose statements in terms of the voice that comes through in them. So let's look at this graduate student purpose statement and compare it. Notice how the student is using these neutral terms like aim, discuss, and strengths and weaknesses. So there's like this real balance there, and we don't know where the student falls. Is the student going to say, ultimately, this paper has more strengths than weaknesses? We don't know. And maybe the student just doesn't want to give that away at the beginning. They want to present their evidence and then kind of finalize that at the end. But let's compare it to the published purpose statement. And again, I didn't make these up. These came from real humans writing. So this published purpose statement says, in what follows, I question whether Alderson has really established his case, right? So now you've got much stronger language. You've got a first person, you've got a very strong verb, question, and then you have like this calling to action, like, did he really prove his point? So this is something that, you can learn once you know the forms that experts use. And so that's what the next section is going to be about. What are these forms and how can I use them? All right, so this is going to be like a little language lesson. Just imagine that you're in language class, and it's not a foreign language though. Maybe you can think of it as like learning a different dialect, all right? And the dialect is like expert writing. So what constitutes an academic voice? Well, this is what researchers have defined it as. It's not objective. It's not faceless. It acknowledges, constructs, and negotiates social relations. So notice relations, it's not dumping information. It's a negotiation of relationships. You, the writer, the audience is the reader, and all the other voices from the literature, that conversation that you've joined, and indicating how writers evaluate material and acknowledge alternative views. So this is how we look at it from a linguistic perspective, is these things. These are definitions. And I'm going to present 3 different ways that we can do this in our writing: stance, self-identification, and engagement. And throughout the slide set, you'll notice that I have tried to color code each of them so that you can start to think about them in terms of, okay, well, what does this look like in real English words? I want to give you the resources. When I say resources, I mean words, phrases. I actually want you to have something tangible to take away. So the first sort of strategy for developing your voice is something called stance. Stance has to do with how writers position themselves in relationship to other voices. So remember, joining that conversation. How do they evaluate the subject matter? How do they identify what's like solid versus debated or just totally missing from the conversation? And how they express certainty and doubt. And that's a big one, because oftentimes this is what's missing in a novice writer, is they're not expressing any sort of clarity about how certain they are or how doubtful they are. So in terms of stance, when we talk about stance in academic writing, we're talking about how authors express these relationships, how they manage them, and how confident or cautious they are to guide the reader through the interpretation. This is a table that has kind of 4 types of stance features, and you may or may not know these. And as I said earlier, I'm going to give you some prompts that you can use with a generative AI tool like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, so that if you don't know what these tools are, the language model knows it's a language model. So you don't have to worry about what is a hedge. I forgot what she said is a hedge. Language models will know what that is because that's what they do best, language. They don't do math so well, but they really are quite good at language, kind of like me. So hedges soften, or they caution, or they kind of separate the writer from the reader, okay? Or not the writer from the reader, sorry, the writer from the text that the writer is explaining. So this might look like may or might or could. Those are verbs, modal verbs. Or it could be an adverb like likely or perhaps or possibly. So notice these aren't the words that you might actually notice in science writing. Usually when we think about science writing, we think about jargon, right? We think about those big, long words that are discipline specific and that an expert wouldn't know, but those aren't the words that really matter in a voice. What matters in a voice is these like words that we commonly overlook, like may, might, could. And so Hedging is when you want to sort of distance yourself from whatever you're explaining. Maybe you're not sure about this finding, or maybe it's a tentative finding that the research hasn't well established yet. And so you need to hedge that. The opposite of a hedge is a booster, okay? So a booster does exactly what I said, the opposite. It emphasizes confidence, conviction, and certainty. And so words like must, should, certainly, no doubt, these things kind of strengthen or enhance our language, and they're much more decisive. And of course, sometimes when you want to make a strong point, they can be really useful. Then we have counters. Counters help to navigate the contrast. So these are words like however, or although, or still, yet, alternatively, when the writer wants to show a contrast. Okay, now this is different from a distance. Distance is like doubt. I'm not sure about this. Contrast is, I don't just doubt, I'm pretty sure, I know I'm sure about this, and I want to make a definite distinction between what I think and what this other writer thinks. And finally, we have reformulation. And this is just phrases like, for instance, or example, that help you to emphasize a point or to say it in a different way. And together, all of these things are called, we call them function words in linguistics. So that means they like serve a purpose to accomplish a function, a communicative goal, are like unnoticeable words perhaps, but they pack a big punch in terms of helping the idea and the information to move forward, so the reader really knows like how you're positioning yourself in the context of what you're talking about. It's not just like, what am I saying, but how do you feel about what you're saying? That is stance. So some examples of stance that are really easy that usually people can recognize is reporting verbs. So every time you cite a source, you're going to use, most of the time, you're going to use a reporting verb. And so these are words like says or claims or shows when you want to report a direct finding from the literature. And I used to say, no matter what level I taught at, whether I was teaching like beginning ESL students who were just learning language or graduate students who were writing their dissertations, I would say, I want you to try to never repeat a reporting verb in the whole of your paper. Try to have only unique reporting verbs, because it will really challenge you to consider, okay, when I choose this verb, if I'm going to choose something like here from the middle, like states or discusses or says or writes, then I'm establishing myself as like firmly neutral. There's not a lot of voice in that, right? And these are the most common ones that students will use or novice writers will use. Once we start to branch out to the sides of this kind of table, I guess you could say, over here on the left, we have tentative. So these are like hedges. They're distancing, the writer is distancing him or herself from the text. So if you said someone speculates about this, or someone's theorizing, that's different from stating or claiming. Theorizing means they have this idea, I'm not sure if it's true or not, right? And then over here, you have the opposite. You have these very strong assertive reporting verbs where you can see that the writer is explaining something that they're very certain about. So I just encourage you to really seek some diversity in your verbs. And I think it's really simple because there are lots of lists of reporting verbs on the internet. If you don't know, you can just Google reporting verbs. And you can certainly ask a generative AI, like, help me think of a new verb to replace this verb without strengthening or, kind of cautioning my language. I want it to remain the same. So once you have an idea in your head about how you want to approach something, you can get some help from generative AI. So this diagram is adapted from my friend Denise's dissertation. She's interested in scientific communication. Specifically, her dissertation was on congressional hearings and how the congressmen carried out their conversations with the scientists, like during COVID or during natural disasters, or talking about climate change, and those kinds of things.
Kimberly, we lost your screen sharing, I think. Oh no, sorry. This has happened before with Zoom. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. No, I know what you did. There are two little tabs at the top. I know exactly what you did. Yeah, so Denise has a great graphic, but for me, I wanted to break it down just a little bit farther because I wanted to be sure that if you're not a linguist, you could understand this. So we have academic writing at the top, yeah. And you know what we put in academic writing. You know, you need sources, you're going to collect data, you're going to analyze that data, and you're going to write about your findings, and you're going to interpret your findings. Well, for every single piece of that puzzle, you need to be thinking about what is the information about this? So, what is the information I'm providing about my sources? And you need to think about how do I as an author take a stance toward that. So how committed am I to this claim? So for sources, information and commitment to, and data, information about, commitment to, or stance. Commitment just means stance. For every single thing you do, I think you need to be thinking about that. That doesn't mean that you need to add a stance marker in every sentence, but probably you're not doing enough of this unless you're already an expert writer. So just starting to sort of make a little progress in that area will make a big difference, I think. Here are just a few prompts that you might try to engage with the generative AI. I'm not going to read this to you because we'll provide the slides for you, but I just wanted to show you sort of what this might look like if you wanted to engage with the generative AI, like a linguistic assistant, because I don't expect you to remember what these things are. It took me years of training and learning about these. But I think that if you can start to add it to your sort of vocabulary of how you talk about your writing, it will help you to improve. Okay, the second strategy is self-identification. So stance was the first one. Now we're moving on to the second one, which is self-identification. This is expressing your identity through explicit self-reference. So, authorial voice, reflecting personal perspectives or experiences, and connecting ideas to the author's like lived context or opinion. And you'll see this in phrases like I argue, or my experience suggests, or we believe if you were writing with a team. And it's really the clearest way that a writer can signal presence. And in some disciplines, specifically in qualitative research, it's expected. So these are the three indicators of self-identification. If you want to dig a little deeper into this, it shows up in academic writing in basically three ways. I'm not going to say these are the only three ways, but I think as a starter guide, these are the three ways that you might want to think about it. First person pronouns, so that can be I or we, me or us, to convey personal experience or authorial presence. Passive and active voice, so with active emphasizing the subject and passive emphasizing the action on the object, or maybe emphasizing the object. And I've got some examples here. And the last type of self-identification is clearly using kind of what they say and distinguishing that from what I say as a writer. And so novices will often write facts that they have read about and found out about through their research, because you're doing a lot of reading, right? You're reading all these different research articles, and sometimes I think for me, I sort of forget, like, did I make that up or did I read that somewhere? And I can't remember. So you've got to take good notes for one thing. And then you have to really try to figure out, like, okay, where am I writing from my own perspective and where am I bringing in somebody else's voice? And there's a great book if you're interested in this and you want to develop your voice about this. It's called They Say, I Say. Okay, that's the name of the book. They Say, I Say. And it trains you in how to distinguish your voice from the voice of all those sources that you are referring to. So here's another example of this so you can see what it looks like in context. Again, this comes from my research. So we have grad student purpose statement here on the left. In the following critique, this was like a research article critique for a course assignment. The article is examined in terms of, and then we have this list of items that will be sort of explained in the critique. Let's compare that to this published statement on the right. In this critique, so it's very similar at the outset, right? They're stating the genre or what kind of text they're writing. In this critique, it is contended. Now, they also could have said, I contend, but maybe in this specific field, I don't remember which field this is in, maybe they prefer passive voice. Some disciplines prefer passive voice. So it is contended that Ross's study is flawed. Okay, so that's a pretty bold statement, right? I imagine this to be somebody at the top of their game, right in the middle of their career. They're very well published, they're well established, and so they can make these really broad, kind of assertive claims, but they're not just making them, they're backing them up with evidence. And even this evidence is assertive. They're neither distinct enough, nor can they exclude other factors. So this is how experts do this in an assertive and sort of evaluative way. This is what we're talking about when we say like self-identification. So really they say, I say. So you can see he here is the writer of the study that is being critiqued. So there's a lot of distance there, and there's a lot of they say, I say. And if you're looking at this, which sentence feels like the author's taking a risk? Clearly, it is going to look and feel like a risk. And I'm not saying you're going to be comfortable with it. You're probably not going to be comfortable with it. It's just to start thinking about this and what this is going to look like for you. Eventually, way down the road, you may be able to do it at this level when you are an expert. But right now, you just want to start to notice it because awareness is always the first step. And then another way to think about it is like, which sounds safer? And definitely this is very safe. I'm going to critique this article, I'm going to examine it. I'm going to examine X and Y and Z. Neutral, right? Very, very neutral. Whereas this has a valence. It has an assertive tone. Here's some prompts that you might use. And again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read these to you, but if you haven't really fully processed what it means to identify yourself in your writing, self-ID, you could use these prompts to kind of push you in that direction. And also these prompts are designed to work with you on an assignment side by side and not to have the machine writing for you. That's never the goal, because writing needs to be a struggle. And so this is a way to kind of help you make progress in that struggle without being overwhelmed by trying to figure it all out by yourself. Okay, the third major category is engagement markers. So we've had stance, we've had self-ID, and the third one is engagement markers. Engagement is how a writer addresses the reader, sometimes directly, and I'll show you what that looks like, anticipates the reader's knowledge or reaction. So how do we write in a journal that's very, very steeped in our field versus writing in a journal where it's more general and interdisciplinary? We would have a different approach, right? And how the writer guides the reader's understanding or response. So when does the writer prompt the reader to think deeply? When does the writer prompt the reader to refer to another source or provide a little extra context? So this is what engagement means, connection between the reader and the writer. Here's what engagement markers actually look like in academic writing. I'm explaining 5 of them today, along with their function and along with an example. So the first one is a rhetorical question. And I'm sure you've heard of this before when people ask something and they don't expect an answer. They're just prompting reflection or highlighting a sort of tension in the context. So writers can do this by asking readers a question just to have them reflect. So for example, how can practitioners mitigate the challenges that graduate students face? This kind of question pulls the reader in and invites a shared inquiry. Okay. And this is what really like outstanding writers do because they have confidence and they know that asking a question doesn't mean they don't know what they're talking about. Asking a question doesn't indicate a lack of confidence. It actually indicates a lot of confidence to guide the reader to stay in charge of where the writing is moving as you move them along through the article or dissertation or whatever you're writing. Another type of engagement marker is a directive. So that tells the reader what to do, not in a bossy way, but as a guide. Think of phrases like consider the following or note that. These structure how we want the reader to move through the text. And I like to tell people when you're a writer, you might think that you're driving the car, but you're not. You're not the driver, you're the GPS. The reader is actually the driver. The reader is driving the car because they can turn around, they can go back, they can take a side trip and read one of your sources. They're making choices about where they go in your text. You're the GPS giving them those directions. If you give really good directions, that reader will never have to turn the car around. They will never make a wrong turn. And it will just be a smooth, smooth navigation to their destination. So that's what engagement does through rhetorical questions, through directives, and through asides. So that's the third type of engagement marker. Asides are those little parenthetical comments or like little insertions, things like interestingly, or it's worth noting that. They're conversational, but in a good way, and they help the writer to sound human because you don't want the writer to sound like a robot. We used to say that, and we didn't actually mean that the writer might sound like a robot. But now we actually mean you don't want to sound like a robot because we now have machines that can do this for us. So more than ever, it's important for you to understand what it means to have a strong voice. The fourth marker of engagement is appeals to shared knowledge. So this is when you assume something is like common ground or commonly understood. So you might say something like, as we know, the laws of physics, blah, blah, blah. And this is a way that you establish credibility and shared knowledge or alignment with your reader. It's a way of saying like, okay, you and I both know this, and then moving on. So appeals to shared knowledge are really critical for, making a relationship with your reader. And finally, we have acknowledgement of objections. And you may be thinking of this as like a counter argument. It's a powerful rhetorical move that occurs in phrases like, one might argue that, which signals that you're sort of anticipating what the reader's doubt may be and you're ready to respond. It builds trust. It makes your argument more robust. And if you don't know what the reader might counter argue, it's the perfect opportunity to ask a generative AI to help you think of what might the reader argue against. So you're like anticipating what that conversation is. And we could never do this before generative AI, really, unless we hired a coach or sat with with a peer and had a conversation with them. We've never been able to like approximate what we think somebody might say back to us as they were reading, may counter argue. But now we can. We can use generative AI as a thought partner, and we can sort of practice this and then build it into our writing. And as with the other types of voice markers, there's some prompts here to help you enhance your engagement that provide a way for you to just, again, start to understand what this means so that you're not doing it on your own. You have a little bit of support. And in this way, what I'm saying is that generative AI can kind of scaffold this process for you so that you don't need a coach sitting right beside you. You could use a generative AI. Now, when I say that, I say it with caution because if you're very, very self-conscious, you always will want to check that with a human because as a novice, especially if you're kind of just learning about research writing, you're just starting your graduate studies, I would say be really careful with this because you what tends to happen is people overshoot the mark, okay? And that's and you don't want to sound overconfident, and you don't want to be boosting too much or risk kind of veering off into a tone that isn't academic. And it takes some time. So generative AI is like a good starting point for you. And then if you're not feeling completely confident, I would run it by a human. Okay, so let's just review, and then I'm going to give you some in context, like in a lit review, in the methods examples. There are 3 different ways that you can approach enhancing your voice. We've got stance, self-identification, and engagement. Stance is what you're emphasizing or what you're downplaying. So certainty and doubt. Self-identification is where you're showing up as a writer with your own beliefs. And engagement is how you're interacting with the reader. You could call it interaction. It doesn't matter what we call it, right? We can call it engagement, we can call it interaction, we can call it they say, I say, but it's relationship building. Okay. Are there any pressing questions that I should answer before I move on? I see a lot of things going on in the chat.
Yeah, Kimberly, I was addressing some questions that I think it's just good to address now. Like there's questions around certain disciplines, and I was kind of making the point that some of this is a bit subjective, in the sense that APA 7, when it was released, differed from APA 6 because it encourages the use of pronouns um, instead of saying like the researcher. But some experienced researchers are not accustomed to this, and so they continue to stay away from pronouns. And then sometimes it's set by the individual academic program, or it could be the journal itself has clear guidelines on the use of pronouns. So I think it's important for you to just understand what are the norms within your discipline in terms of the pronoun approach.
Yes. And you also need to understand that the background of this kind of study for linguistics is descriptive, not prescriptive. So there are people who write rules about what we should and should not do for language. Those are prescriptive, like APA 7, for example, or the people who write these style guides. Those are prescriptive linguists or some sort of writing guide, right? Prescribing, these are the rules. You need to follow these rules. In my field, we look at what people actually do and what happens in the data. We don't adhere to prescribed rule. I mean, I do when I'm writing. Obviously, if I want to get published, I'm going to have to adhere to APA 7 or whatever the style guide is used. But when we look at like what writers actually do, writers, especially as they become more and more and more expert, they start to break the rules because they have that confidence, right? So yes, it's always going to be discipline specific and it's going to be genre specific. So if you're looking at a critique, you're going to get a lot more stance than you will in an empirical article. If you're looking at qualitative, you're going to get a lot more personal pronouns than quantitative or even mixed methods. And then it's personal too. Like I am very uncomfortable with using I in my writing, but if I have a teammate, I'm happy to use we. And I can't really explain that. It's just a personal preference. So I would say, look at what the journal is doing. Look at what people are doing in that journal. Are you seeing these forms? Are you able to identify them? That's really the first step. That's what I do when I'm teaching a class like this, is I have people get a highlighter and we use paper and pencil because I like that tactile environment. And I have them highlight, okay, where do you see engagement? Where do you see self-identification? And maybe you don't see it, right? So it's also journal, it's discipline, it's genre, it's journal specific, and it's person specific. Yes, I'm just presenting it as a tool in your toolbox that you can use as you like, if that makes sense. Okay, I see. Okay, yes, I do want to address this question from Khalud. Is positioning in this sense similar to reflexivity in research? It can be, but in qualitative research, you often write something like a positionality statement, which is an actual section of your research where you say your background and what you are. And that has its own kind of a format and a way that you do that. That's not exactly what I'm talking about, because that's like a section. I'm saying this is a linguistic tool that could be applied in any section just to increase the engagement and the interaction between you and the reader. But it's a really good question, and I meant to say that, and I just forgot. Okay. Here's an example of this. And so what I did here is I color coded the stance, the self-identification, and the engagement so that you could see how they're working together. And so let's break it down. So first of all, we have, all right, let's look at just the stance markers first. The first stance marker that you see here is only one piece of a larger puzzle, okay? So it's not even, you didn't, when you read that, you don't think it's an opinion, right? But it sort of is. It's saying there's a big thing we're looking at here, and this is just a small piece of it. That is stance. That word only, again, you might gloss right over it, but it really has, that is a way to show a gap, right? Or to show a problem that has emerged that I want to focus on. And then the writer goes on to say, myopic focus, so narrowly focused in on one thing, right? And unwittingly discounts. So that means it's too narrow, and as a result, it is overlooking other things. That's very strong stance right there. Now, you don't see any jargon. You don't see any discipline-specific words. These are generic words that anybody might use, but they take a real stance. Other examples are argue as a reporting verb of what I am actually arguing, and a modal verb must, and modal verb could, and modal verb can. A modal verbs are really are quite easy. There's only 12 of them, and so once you know them, you can really use them to develop your stance. Again, if you don't know what a modal verb is, that's okay. You can ask Google, you can ask a language model. You don't need to become a linguist to use these linguistic resources. Self-identification, you see I, you see we. The we is like the collective we. It's not the researcher's team. It's like the collective we. We of this discipline must better understand this topic. And then engagement markers are where the writer and the writer is trying to sort of invite the reader into the discussion. So that's an example of voice in context. And then let's take a look at what happens when we combine human writing with generative AI. In this case, I used Quillbot. So let me tell you what I did here. I did this little mini kind of, it's not a study, it's just like a mini little exercise. I wrote something, and what I wrote was this. This is my human writing. And I went to Quillbot. And as you know, if you've used Quillbot, it has a little like magic button you can press, and it will take your human writing and it will make it into something bigger and seemingly better. But now that you know about these three aspects of voice, I want you to notice that what it added is really just stance. Stance should be blue here. So these blue words are stance markers. We've got this adjective crucial. So if you have used any AI recently, you know that they tend to overuse the word crucial. We don't know why. I don't know why an AI chooses, and delve. I'm sure you've heard that people are making jokes about this, but crucial is a stance marker. Carefully is a stance marker, highlights the need for further research. These are stance markers. Ensure there is no self-identification, obviously, because Quillbot is a bot. It doesn't have a self, so it can't identify, and there is no engagement. So even though it made a lot more words appear, and those words are perfect grammar, they're spelled right, that punctuation is just right, it's polished academic writing for all intents and purposes, it looks better than the previous thing that the human wrote, right? But it's still missing self-identification and engagement. It's still not at the top of its game, so to speak. So just be careful if you're using these things to know like what an AI can and cannot do. It can help you sound more academic, but it will not help you show up more fully in your writing. And that's what I'm trying to help you understand how to do, is how to show up and understand these rhetorical features. Okay, let's look at some examples in lit reviews. And so again, these are actual examples from my research. I collected a huge corpus of graduate student coursework writing. So this was like writing that graduate students were putting into assignments. It was not their dissertations, not their theses, nothing like that. So over here, we have sort of the neutral version, and over here we have an improved version. If you look at the word mini is a booster. It emphasizes quantity, which can suggest that a particular limitation is widespread or significant, but it is still a little bit more hedged than most. Most studies means almost all of them, okay? Many means a majority of studies, but maybe not all of them. Maybe 51%, 60%, I don't know. We can't put a quantitative number on it. But these words that, again, we might just gloss right over them if we're reading, they really have an impact. Most studies have focused on is very, very strong. You need a lot of evidence to make that claim, okay? But many studies is a little softer. It's still a booster, but when I'm talking about hedges and boosters, like there's a sliding scale or a spectrum that they occur on. And again, this is not going to come to you immediately and naturally. You're going to have to know the literature, and you're going to have to know the words, and you're going to have a relationship with all of these things in order to get to where that feels comfortable for you. But this word only, again, so you might just pass right over it, but it packs a big punch here. The existing accounts do not resolve a contradiction between. So a contradiction, that's good. We're seeing something in the literature that's disagreement. But here, an addition of the word fully gives us just a little bit of extra information. So a little bit more stance. A lot of times in research, we're not like resolving something 100%. We never can resolve some things 100%, but we might get a little bit of a more clear picture of things. And so that's what this word is doing for us here. Okay, I'm going to skip through and I'm just going to show you that I have examples. I see the time is getting short. I have examples for each section of a research paper, for methods, for results, for discussion and conclusion. So you can come back to these and you can look at them and you can see like what's happening here. But I want to go ahead and finalize what I wanted to say and open it up for questions. So after all these examples that you've seen, here's where we land. The real challenge of academic writing is it's not just about grammar, structure, punctuation, spelling, APA formatting. It's not these things that you may have gotten feedback on. I have a theory, and this is just a theory. People don't know how to give good feedback. A lot of times they're experts in their discipline maybe, but they don't know how to give good writing feedback. So they can tell you that like something seems off, the tone isn't just right, but they can't explain how to make that happen. A lot of times what's going on is they're telling you that there's no voice, that you're absent in the writing. But you can't overdo it. You have to keep balance. So how do we express certain uncertainty without sounding like we're unsure of ourselves? Because that's not the goal either, right? When we express uncertainty, we still want to have confidence in our uncertainty, if that makes sense. How do we project that confidence without overreaching the evidence? So, we can't say more than what we found in the evidence. So we want to sound confident about the evidence without making it sound like more than it is. How do we show up in the text without making it self-centered, self-focused, and all about us? And how do we guide the reader without sounding kind of condescending or performative, so that we're kind of adding these things that aren't really our voice? If you start to feel performative, I would just say don't do it. I mean, none of this is going to make or break your publication, but I do think it will help you understand the sort of high wire act of keeping your academic voice while still involving other people who really matter. And it's not that you're going to have a bigger vocabulary or use more jargon. You're just making deliberate rhetorical choices. And that's really what stance, engagement, and self-identification do. I think I skipped a slide. Oh, I do have one more slide about prompting, so I'll just leave that for you to read later. The final thing I want to say is if you're working with generative AI, really be careful. Voice in academic writing is not about sounding fancy. It's about showing up as who you are. You're not just reporting research. You're claiming a seat at the table in the conversation. And this is not just allowed, it's not learning to break the rules. It really is expected as you become more and more of an expert, which really is your goal. Your goal is not to write that lit review. I mean, it is, but that's part of the process of becoming an expert. And so I think if you can just, again, start to raise awareness about these strategies, then you'll become a more confident writer. And I'm happy to answer questions or.
Thanks, Kimberly. There was a good question. So toward the end, someone said, like, when would it be appropriate to use the word some when referring to quantity based on the position they're taking? And I was initially going to say, I think the goal here is to get you to be more intentional, be a bit more precise. Like if it's just a few studies, then say a few. That's more precise and clear than saying some. I think a lot of people throw out some and they're not very intentional about what exactly they mean. But I don't know if you want to add to that, Kimberly.
Yeah, this is such a common question. I mean, I can't tell you how many ESL students over the years have asked me, how many is a few? How many is many? How many is most? How many is some? We don't have a quantity, but some is very, very vague. As Jessica said, a few, it indicates maybe we need more. And actually, think about the difference between a few and few. If
Mhm.
I say few studies have examined, that means almost none. But if I say a few have examined, and this will really blow your mind if you're a non-native speaker, because it really is like so tiny, that difference between few and a few. But yeah, we just don't have good quantitative ways.
Yeah, I think it's just important to be, like I said, intentional. I'll tend to say things, or even I'll see like a gap statement by a graduate student because they often have to make that gap statement very clear in their introductory chapter and their lit review. And they'll say no research, as in zero. And I'll say, that's unlikely that there's zero research. Even if there is zero research, that's a difficult place to be if you're a graduate student trying to do research for the first time. And so typically you'll hedge and say little to no research because it's possible that there's something that you missed. But yeah, it's this idea of being really intentional, and you have to know your subject matter and understand what's in the literature in order to say those things. And that's kind of the point. Like you being precise shows to your committee, to the reader, that you've done the homework of understanding where the field stands on whatever claim you're making. I don't see anything else that was missed. I will just add, because I've done this, my version of this webinar in the past, and something that comes up that I get afterwards is around like, it's really hard for me to address all of this when I'm writing. I feel paralyzed because I don't know yet how to write this way. And my advice to that is to start just becoming more aware of your tendencies in your writing, and then create your personalized like editing and revision checklist. So if you know you have a tendency to use neutral reporting verbs, or you aren't a confident writer and you're not taking a stance, just add this to the list of things that you do when you go in to revise, because it's not always natural to write this way. And I would say that we don't typically see stance show up, especially with novice writers, novice researchers, in early drafts. But when you go in and intentionally only look at stance and self-ID and engagement whenever you're writing, that can just be a part of your revision strategy. I did share the slides in the chat. We will send out an email. We'll add this recording to our YouTube channel. I'll send out an email either later today or early tomorrow with the slides attached and a link to the recording online so that you can access this again later. And we host webinars on different topics every single month. So feel free to reach out if you want to join our mailing list. If you got an email about this webinar, then you're already on our mailing list. But if you want to join our mailing list, I'll put my email in here so you can send it to me. It's hello@thedissertationcoach.com, and we can make sure that you get invited to future webinars. Kimberly, there's actually a really good question that just came up. Do you want to address that?
About the ethical line and using generative AI. Yeah, everybody asks us this. So here's what I tell people. I say there's a way that you can prompt it to act as a writing coach or mentor and not as a ghostwriter. If it's starting to write for you, rewrite, revise, you're edging into the danger zone. I would say, like, if you would feel comfortable downloading your chat with an AI and showing it to your reader and saying, here's how I got to the point that I'm at in the writing. I'm not ashamed of it. You can see what I asked. You can see how it responded. You can see that I didn't like copy paste some entire section. I think, and if you could, if you know that your writing is that you are really understanding it enough that if somebody asked you a question, like in an oral defense, let's say somebody invited you to say, okay, so you wrote this, can you help me understand a little more? If you feel confident to do that, then I don't see anything wrong with you using it to help you along the way. But I'm saying that from a position of power where I'm not a student. Nobody's ever going to say to me, like, did you use, I'm not going to be accused of that. And I'm sorry if you are in that position where you might be accused. It's a very, very common question. And we have a YouTube channel. If you want to see or hear some more, I was just about to type that in the answer. I'll put the YouTube channel in the chat so everybody can see it.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that. If you're prompting the AI, you could say, act as a writing coach. Give me a list of areas that I need to improve. And maybe you could even say, you give me some examples with a similar topic so that you're not tempted to use its examples. Because once you unsee that, it's hard to unsee it. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee it, and that can put you in this place where you feel uncomfortable. So just be really clear in what you're asking for. I think a lot of folks go in and they're very vague and they'll say, help me revise this or help me edit this. And then yes, it'll often just start rewriting your work. And then it puts you in this difficult position where it's hard to have that, to put it in the back of your mind because it is so polished. We are out of time. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, I'll send out the information, the slides later with the recording, and stay tuned for our webinar announcement for next month. Thanks. Thanks, Kimberly.
My favorite thing to talk about.